Hello and welcome to Economic Analysis. This semester we're going to be spending time learning about economics, but in particular analysis. This is about solving problems and not memorizing stuff. I tell you this because I don't want you to underestimate this class. Most of you are in engineering, and engineering is hard. And it's hard because it has mathematics and it's got problem solving. And economics is just one of those required subjects that you have to take. Or you've chosen it as an elective and you're welcome to that. But either way, you might underestimate this course. You might think it's an easy A or that it's not going to take much time. But because this is analysis, we're going to be focusing on problem solving. We're going to be focusing on mathematics. But at this level, we're not going to show you much of the mathematics. We're going to show you, though, all of the logic. So what are we about in economic analysis? The first thing is it's about theory and evidence. And it's not just data-driven. It is not just empirical. And one of the reasons for that is because of what we call the why question, or causality. It's very important that you understand that economics is all about that question, why? And many courses are not. Many courses are about what? You know, certainly a lot of courses try to get to why, but there is often a core of material that if you just memorize, you'll be okay. In economics, if you just memorize, you're not going to be okay at all. You have to understand the reasoning behind things and how things happen and how things come together. And that can be kind of a challenge. So, when we think about what is, we're often thinking of just correlation. And what we really want to know is when are two items correlated because one of them caused the other. And that's going to be really critical for us as we go through this course and try to figure out what's what. Now, my name is Steve Myers. I have a PhD in economics. I got it in 1980, and I've been at the University of Akron all of my career. I retired from the University of Akron in 2020, and before that, I picked up a little consulting gig on the side where I would go and work in economic data science. In fact, I held the first data science day at the University of Akron a number of years ago. And it's because I believe that economists put the science in data science. And we can argue in a different location or a different time if you have some challenge to that. It doesn't mean that others don't participate in what we consider data science, but that economics brings, an economist brings certain values. So I show you a picture of my course catalog. That's me lecturing a few years ago at LSU. I was fortunate enough to be named a Distinguished SAS Educator. SAS is a software program that I've used over 40 years, and indeed, this was a global award, and I was going to receive it at the SAS Global Forum in 2020. I would have seen all those nice cherry blossoms, but of course, we had something that was called the pandemic. Nevertheless, I spent quite a bit of time going campus to campus, location to location, talking about how one can integrate economics and SAS in their data science. Now, most of these were very SAS oriented, SAS user conventions and so forth. One of those occurred in Chicago, and I was there for the first time at the Midwest SAS Users Group in Chicago. So everybody gets these name tags, and mine said first time attendee and a speaker. And SAS is my primary language. There are all kinds of ribbons they hand out. They want you to sort of buy into their thing and put it on your tag. And one of them that was offered to me and almost insisted that I put on was data driven. And I refused. I actually said, no, I'm not going to put on data driven. And there were a number of people running around in data driven t shirts, and they were wondering why. And it's simply that data does not have the power to explain. Data does not have the power to tell us why. Data alone does not allow us to understand what causes things to occur. Now, only economic theory is able to do that, or some story behind it, some theory behind it. Indeed, Judea Pearl, who is not an economist, in fact, doesn't think a lot about economists, is a person who is clearly says, if you read his Book of Why, that data alone cannot solve causal calculus problems. In fact, Judea Pearl is responsible for the development of what's called do-dot calculus, or do calculus, and that is the calculus of causal decision making. And it's a pretty hefty thing. This book, by the way, I would highly recommend it to you at some point for your understanding. About half, it's not economics at all. It's about cause and effect, and it is accessible to literally everybody for about half the book. After that, you're going to start climbing some pretty steep calculus hills, and some of you may enjoy that. Economics is indeed more than data. It's made up of, for our purposes, theory and evidence. We follow the scientific method in economics, and that is that we're going to tell you a story. I usually use the word story and theory interchangeably. We're going to tell you about theory. These are the economic principles that you're going to be studying this term, and from those principles, we're going to make up some hypothesis, some idea of what we think will occur. And then we're going to collect evidence. Sometimes that evidence is hard quantitative data, sometimes it's qualitative data, but nevertheless it is evidence that we use to determine whether or not our hypothesis can be rejected or, as they say, accepted. Now, if we indeed reject the hypothesis, now for those who are well into statistics here, hypotheses are generally set up to be null hypothesis, that is, to be rejected. I'm using it in a little bit more generic, simpler terms, which instead of saying I'm going to set up a null hypothesis to reject in favor of the other, and that is the proper way of setting this up. I'm basically saying, here's a hypothesis. I think A causes B. And here's my evidence. Do I reject that? Indeed, if I have A, whatever that is, and I have B, and B does not seem to follow from A, then my evidence is that I have rejected it. So that's the sense in which I'm using hypothesis for this discussion. So if we do reject it, then we go back and we revise our theory. We go back and we think about, well, what did we miss? What was it that we forgot? Sometimes we're led astray by correlation, and two things seem to apply. One implies the other. And what we don't see are the confounders, those other pieces of data, those third-party things that are the whole reason we're not seeing the effect. And we're going to see this in our study of demand and supply a lot, because these third-party pieces, these confounders, are the very foundation of how we use demand and supply to analyze and determine prices and output. So you're going to see that, and you're going to see a good bit. Now, sometimes, though, we affirm that hypothesis in the sense that I'm using the hypothesis. I'm really talking about the alternative hypothesis that I have now affirmed. And if we can do that, then we predict. And in the sense of paradigm that we're using, the test of a theory is its ability to predict. So if I have a theory, let's call it law of demand, and law of demand has lots of evidence affirming it. In fact, I will make this statement boldly here, the law of demand has never been disaffirmed. Never. And for that reason, we think of it as a law. And the law of demand is something you're going to be learning. But what it does is it predicts. And it predicts pretty accurately. So that's what we are able to do. Now, sometimes, even though we've affirmed our theory, creativity and ingenuity pops in, and we go back up and we revise the theory because we think we can make it better. And we go through the cycle again. And can this theory explain a little bit better than the old theory, and so forth? And that's kind of how science advances. So clearly, we are theory driven versus being data driven. But all evidence is not created equally. Let's see an example. So here you see an example of the same data being used, but without theory, and I put that in quotes because it's maybe not strictly theory, but you'll get the point here. This can be misused. In fact, let's get all political. This is a political statement. So the world is awful. That is my political statement. And the reason the world is awful, as you can see in the first panel, globally, 3.3% of all children die before they're 15 years old. Each block that you see is 11 children that die every minute of every day. This is terrible. I mean, nobody can argue this is a good statistic. Nobody can argue that the world with this kind of data is a good thing. In fact, we might be all about trying to figure out what can we do? How can we deal with this? How can we live with this? What can we do to fix this? In fact, starting with only the data, which is where we are, starting with only the data, we have a data-driven, see why I don't like the word? We have a data-driven process which says we now have to develop something, probably a policy, to keep children from dying. And I'm not saying that's not laudable. Of course it is. But let's use the data a different way. And in that, let's notice that in the past, 50% of all children died. But today, 4.4% of all children die. Now, the panic we were in the first panel, which we have to do something, there is absolutely nothing more important than this. We have 11 children dying every minute of every day. Again, that's bad, but put it in perspective. Look how much better the world is. The world is not awful. The world is better. It's better than in the past. Okay? So in this case, it might say, well, there's really nothing we can do. We're writing some trend. If I draw a straight line, and this is bad forecasting, I'm going from 50% to 4.4% to, well, eventually 0. So we don't have to do anything. So a third statement becomes, the world can be much better. It is true that 4.4% of children worldwide die. But in the European Union, it's 0.47%. Less than 0.5% of all children die. So the world can be better. And here, what we can do is we begin to look and see what is it that's going on in the European Union that affects child mortality with respect to the rest of the world. Can we emulate that? Can we maybe do some more work and make sure what is it exactly that makes children more likely to survive in the European Union than elsewhere? So here's the same data 3 different times. We call this the observationally equivalent hypotheses. That is, a lot of us can use the same data and come to very different conclusions. What is it that protects us Well, what protects us is the ability to use theory and evidence. So, back to our list. Here's where we were. Economic analysis wants to be positive. Now, every time I've taught this for over 40 years, somebody will say, you mean positive, not negative? No, that's not the argument. This is based on logical positivism, the type of logic that we're following. But when we're being positive, we're asking only what is. And that's kind of important because it's value free. There's nothing in here that is biasing us to one thing or another. It's basically, let's think about how the economy works. That's our theory. Let's think about what data we have and what is the case. What's going on? This is as opposed to what should be. This course will not be about normative economics. Normative economics is what should be. Normative economics gets into issues of, well, equity and things like that, like what's fair. Well, I don't know what fair is. Do you know what fair is? I mean, we want our economy to be fair. We hear things about we want the job market to be fair. But whose definition of fair? And fair to who? We can really disagree when we come into normatives because it's based on the root word norms. What are our norms? Well, my norms may not be your norms. Another way of saying that, my religion may not be your religion. I may have no religion. You may be very much a believer. That may kind of organize our thoughts. So when I think of what's fair, you think of what's fair, we're going to come up with something different. If we think about what should be, well, we do that all the time. Politicians do that all the time. We're not going to do that. We're not going to spend any time this term at all talking about what should be. But here's the key. If you understand how economics works and you understand positive logical statements, then you'll be able to figure out what's going on, and that better informs you to determine what should be. We're going to be talking about problem solving and storytelling. Now, I said before I use the word story often interchangeably with theory because it's exactly what a theory is. A theory says, here's how this works. It starts here, it goes there, this thing happens, something else occurs, there's my conclusion. That's a story. And that's also how we solve problems. One of the things that sets economists apart from many other disciplines is their ability to do problem solving. And indeed, I was just talking to my son, who happens to be the director of analytics for a multi-billion-dollar company. Very proud of him. But in this, he was telling me that of all his employees, he looks at 3 different groups because they can solve problems. Economists, engineers, and lawyers. We actually kind of argued about the last one, but I think he convinced me a little bit. Problem solving is the key because we want to be able to actually come to some kind of a solution. We want to be strategic as well as just thinking tactically. And for that, let's look at it this way. We want to think long-term and not just short-term. What's going on in the long term? So I may have a policy and it has some short-term benefit. I want the government to give everybody $50. I mean, everybody in the country, just send them a check for $50 or better, let's do it $2,000. Wait, this is kind of what we did during COVID. There was a great short-term benefit of sending everybody money, but what was the long-term effect of that? Well, in part, it put a lot of money into circulation. It gave people money that didn't necessarily need it. That occurred during the COVID crisis. And some people really needed it because, like my daughter who's in the service industry, she had no income coming in at all. On the other hand, my wife and I, who work in areas that weren't affected by COVID, uh, we got free money. So, you know, you have to think of what are the benefits both short term and long term. And we'll talk more about long term than that a little bit later on. Now, we also want to talk about the effect on all people, all groups, and not just some, because the effect of that $2,000 payment, for example, I think it was 2,000, maybe it was 1,200. I have now forgotten. It's been a few years, but the effect of that payment that went to me, well, and my wife, we had, maybe it was 1,200, we had $2,400 that we could suddenly decide to spend on something that we hadn't thought about or hadn't needed. Or we could have just saved it, or we could have just paid bills. My daughter and her husband, they got their 2,400. They needed it for rent, for food, for things that, daily necessities. So when we think about different groups in this policy, everybody's going to be benefiting a little bit differently. The first book you're going to be using, and there'll be more on this later, but the first book you're going to be using is Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. And actually, if you're watching this on Monday or Tuesday, the recommendation is you start reading this no later than Wednesday, and you have an essay due next Tuesday. Again, that'll all come out later on. But let's talk about what this book's about. It says economics is haunted by more fallacies than any other study known to man. This is a claim made by Henry Hazlitt, who wrote this book in 1946. Yes, I am assigning to you a book written in 1946 that we will spend this next week looking at, because it is indeed excellent. He distills the economics into one lesson, and that is chapter 1. More than that, he distills it down to one sentence. And it's a very powerful sentence, and it's where I want you to start your study. And we're going to focus on fallacies throughout the course, so we're going to talk about some of these. First off, you need to understand a lot of things I'm going to talk about are going to sound political. A lot of things that you think are political are going to sound like economics. Now, this course is about economics, not politics, but it will sound like the same thing from time to time because politicians not only talk about the economy, they pretend to be able to affect it, and they try to convince you that if you just elect them, they can do this and that. And of course, government clearly can make our economy soar or fail through good and bad policies. But one of the things that Hazlitt talks about in his text, quoting Frederick Bastiat, is how to tell the good economist from the bad economist. And we're going to have lots to say about that as we go through. Here's a good economist. Joan Robinson lived to be 80 years old, as you can see. It was said of Joan Robinson that she wrote clearly, that she could analyze, was very analytical, and she could put complex mathematical concepts into words. That's harder than it sounds. Indeed, a lot of her writings are things that we still refer to. Again, she's a British economist, and it was said that she probably would have been the first female recipient of the Nobel Prize in economics, which kind of made her, at the time the Nobel Prize was coming in and so forth, but she had to be one of the best economists in the country by almost everyone's definition. But it's pretty clear that as she aged, she became more and more Marxist in her views, and a lot of people say that hurt her with the Nobel Committee. It probably did. Now, one of the things that she did was she wrote about the theory of employment in 1937. Now, you may not know this name, and you will hear it a lot when we get especially to Module 11. John Maynard Keynes wrote the theory of interest and employment in 1936. And from that, we got what's called Keynesian economics. And she was very early in this and wrote her book on the theory of employment immediately after Keynes. In fact, you can see in the little picture there that she's known for post-Keynesian economics. It's like Keynes said certain things, and others, like Joan Robinson, took Keynes and started expanding. Okay, so that's really kind of critical there. But as we look through the other works that are listed here on this page, down at the bottom we see she wrote about economic fallacies. So she called them economic heresies, and indeed, it's there. But I start with Joan Robinson because one, she is a Marxist economist, very much so. But two, she made the most brilliant statement, the most honest statement by an economist in all of academia that I've ever heard. Now, not the one on the coffee cup, because that's what a lot of students will say. But what did Joan Robinson say? The purpose of studying economics, the purpose for you studying economic analysis, is not to acquire a set of ready-made answers. You're not going to find it in the book and memorize it and go, oh, now I understand the economy. But you're going to learn how to avoid being deceived by economists. Who's going to deceive you? You say, well, I don't even talk to economists, so that's not going to happen. Well, that's not true. Because of the fact that economics is all around us, it's in our political life, it's in our social life, it has to do with your job, going to work, all kinds of things. Who's going to deceive you? Well, number one, your teachers are going to deceive you. Out of malice or out of ignorance, you're going to get deceived. The media is going to deceive you. Politicians are going to deceive you. Businesses are going to deceive you because everyone is going to be pushing and slanting things to their advantage. So the only way that you cannot be deceived about economics is for you to understand it, and that's where the learning comes in. I'm professing to you a course of how to think for the rest of your life, and I firmly believe that. What happens in the book by Henry Hazlitt is he informs you about this deceit. And it's not always for bad reasons, but it's almost always because you only get part of the analysis and you don't get it all. I want you not to be deceived by anyone, and you need to figure out how to set these problems up and go through them, how to analyze and be honest and humble about what you can actually say. But far more important than that, when you're finished with this class, you should have enough information that when you hear something, no matter how good it sounds, something ought to tick inside of you and go, ooh, I wonder if that's true. Let me go figure out, let me go look for myself. And if that's the case, your job and mine will have been done. I started with a Marxist economist. Well, this guy is also a Marxist economist. Well, he was when he began. He went to the University of Chicago. He studied and got his PhD with one of his professors was Milton Friedman, one of the most conservative economists ever. And he came out of Milton Friedman's class still a Marxist. But he became more orthodox over time, where he's quite conservative now. But forgetting his political bent, he is clearly the greatest living philosopher and economist that there is today. I'm going to recommend a book to you at the end of the course that I think you really ought to take a look at. And it's very easy for you to understand this book because no graphs, no math, no charts, no tables. It's all narrative. And in fact, the audio version of the book will be highly entertaining. And this guy knows his evidence. I've used this book in many courses, and I can guarantee you that you will not regret going through Thomas Sowell. You may not believe everything he says at first. You may not ever believe everything he says, but you will not be able to say, this man's not a scholar, this man's not absolutely brilliant. He goes on to say that economics is not simply a topic on which to express opinions or vent emotion. It's a systematic study of what happens when you do specific things in specific ways. Remember Joan Robinson? Clear, analytic, complex mathematics? Well, Sowell is exactly the same way. And in particular, in economic analysis, the methods used by a Marxist economist, these are Thomas Sowell's words, like Oscar Lange, you don't know who that is, but let's say like Joan Robinson, did not differ in any fundamental way from the methods used by conservative economist Milton Friedman. Now, next thing Sowell shares with us is that the underlying principles are not complicated, but the political rhetoric and the economic jargon can make these events seem murky. So if I start throwing around economic jargon, or you do, or somebody near you starts throwing around all of these phrases that we use, and every discipline has its own special language that sort of excludes people. You know, if that happens, it seems like nobody can understand this stuff. But the principles, as Sowell says, are unknown to most of the public and the media. And we're going to see some real demonstrations of this through the term. And I'm hoping that you will be well educated, even better than the media that you consume. Sowell also says in the end of his book, for those willing to stop and think, basic economics provides some tools for evaluating policies and proposals in terms of their logical implications and empirical consequences. That's the key, right? But he also says there at the top, it's useful for understanding issues, but it's not going to be as emotionally satisfying as more personal and melodramatic descriptions of these events or depictions of these issues found in the media and politics. It's going to be boring because it doesn't have the emotion that politics certainly does. Just go watch the candidates for president. You watch either one of them. The emotions are dripping. And it's because they want you to buy into their side of that argument. Perhaps the most important distinction is between what sounds good and what works. Sowell just gives you a key here to figuring out what is good economics. Sowell also wrote quite a book on economic facts and fallacies, and I can recommend that book to you as well. It's a little harder to get through than his basic economics. It's a little deeper and a little bit more advanced, but it is really, really good. Now, Sowell says economics fallacies depends upon thinking of the economy as a set of zero-sum transactions, ignoring competition, or not thinking beyond the initial consequences. So the first thing we're going to do is to get to where we believe that some of the things are a zero-sum transaction. Now, a zero-sum transaction means that I can only benefit if somebody is harmed. A zero-sum transaction is how a lot of politicians will tell you the world works. That rich person got rich by hurting that poor person. They took it from the poor. Or this company got something, so that company failed, or whatever. And it seems like there's only so much out there, that the pie is fixed. And because the pie is fixed, if you get a bigger piece of that economic pie, that means there's less available for me. Therefore, I don't want you to get a bigger piece of the pie. I'm against your success. Because I believe your success, let's say you do something and you become a billionaire. Well, that's not fair because you took it from me. This is a zero-sum fallacy. It is not how the economy works. Indeed, innovation makes everything grow. There's a fantastic example of this. Back when I was just about ready to graduate high school, 1968, this book came out by Dr. Paul Ehrlich. And it was called The Population Bomb. And the choice was we could either control population or we would all die out. In fact, in the 70s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. And at this late date, nothing can prevent a substantial increase in the world's death rate. Now, all of you are raised on a steady diet of fear. This thing is happening. The world is over. It's just a matter of time. This book still has its adherents. This book, this idea, still has people today saying we have to lower the population of the earth because we don't have enough food. This goes back to Thomas Malthus, was an economist who said population grows arithmetically and food supply will be outstripped by our multiplication of our human race. And we won't have enough to eat. The earth cannot produce enough food. Well, it's been well over 100 years since Malthus, and well, we're all eating pretty good. In fact, caloric intake across the world is much higher than when he wrote. Well, what about Ehrlich? Well, nothing can help us. Well, as it turned out, economist Julia Simon made a bet, a $1,000 bet in 1980, and told Simon, you go out and you pick any materials you want, because Simon says we're running out of resources. And it's the increase in population that's doing it, because we got more people and they're using more things, and we're going to run out of everything. And Simon says that's not true. You pick any 5 things you want. Copper, chromium, nickel, tin, and tungsten was what Ehrlich picked, and they made a bet. 10 years later, Ehrlich had lost the bet. All of those materials were in greater abundance. Now, shortage kind of predicts that what happens, things get short, the price skyrockets, it goes up, and we have to pay more for it, and so forth. How did Simon win this bet? And was it a fluke? Well, first off, Simon completely dismissed the idea that population growth has to inevitably result in poverty and famine, because human ingenuity is the ultimate resource. The reason we have not outgrown our food supply is that we're constantly being inventive about how we grow our food, raise our food, supply our food, distribute our food. All these ideas of how to get food to all the people has happened through the marketplace, and everybody has more food now than they did before. Humans innovate their way out of scarcity by either increasing the supply, making a substitute for that thing, or finding ways to get around and innovate around the barrier. In fact, Simon goes on to say the more population, the more humans, and the more humans, the more human ingenuity. Therefore, we need greater numbers of people. Can he be right? Well, let's take a look. The Cato Institute redid the experiment because one of the arguments was, well, it was only a 10-year period, and the 80s were weird, and Ehrlich would have won if it had been any other time period. Well, this experiment's been run 100 times on available data. Cato redid it between 1960 and 2016. That is a 56-year period, at what time the population of the world more than doubled. It grew 145% by adding 4.5 billion people. And the income per person in 1960 was only $3,700. But by 2016, it was $10,400. That's a 183% increase. So income grew faster than the population. The population grew, but we're all better off. How did that happen? They looked at 42 different resources, and the inflation adjusted price of those resources all grew at 33%. What does this mean? When things are in short supply, price goes up, no doubt. So as things were shorter in supply, more pressure put on them, more people, prices went up 33%. But when you adjust that for the rise in income, okay, your food is 33% more, but you have much more income. Look at the top table. 145% growth in population. Let's say everybody eats about the same stuff, right? Income goes up 183%. You can afford the higher price. So let's adjust those prices of 42 resources for the amount of income. So it's like, okay, you have to spend more on your groceries, but what percentage is it of your overall income? It's less. In fact, it fell by 53%. The world went up by 4.5 billion people, but our food, our resources got cheaper by half. Humanity creates faster than it consumes. That's the key. Want another example? At the red line, when the population bomb was published, 50% of the world's population was in extreme poverty. We had 3 billion people, and the red height is about half of that, and they were in extreme poverty. Now, by 2015, the population on Earth had more than doubled, but the number of people in extreme poverty was vanishing. The United Nations have even said ending extreme poverty is within our reach. Well, how does that happen if we have all these people? The second thing that Sowell tells us is an economic fallacy, other than thinking of the economy as a zero-sum transaction, which we just went through. It's ignoring the role of competition in the marketplace. So when we think about this, let's say you're going to try to buy something and it's very expensive. Perhaps there's only one seller of that item and it might be brand new. It's a very high price, and we think the company may be price gouging. In fact, one of the political candidates has now said, we're going to take care of that price gouging. If I'm elected, we're going to get rid of that. It's the company's price gouging. And we want government to force their results, because government can use force and coercion to make things happen. So let's force people who produce this item to take less, and by doing that, we will solve a problem. And people will be able to have this thing cheaper. All that sounds good. In fact, the people who are buying that item that's being produced right now will pay less because of government forcing, and that'll be good. But the company making it isn't going to be able to make as much profit, so in the long run, perhaps they end up going out of business. But one of the things that won't happen is, because there's such a low profit margin, new innovation, invention may not be able to take root. Because when you make the first item, it's always more expensive. So how are producers going to come through and compete? Because you've outlawed competition. And you may say, we didn't outlaw competition, we just said you can't sell for more than this. It's the profit margin that signals to the resources, somebody ought to go in here and solve this problem. How did this happen? Well, I just bought a 55-inch TV for well under 300. And I recall not long ago when 55-inch TVs didn't exist, and they were extraordinarily expensive when they first came out. I mean, thousands and thousands, maybe $2,000-3,000. And I remember when flat screen TVs didn't even exist. In fact, I was born in the 50s, so you can see my TV right there on the top, right? And how it progressed. Well, all those TVs up to about 2000, they were all tube TVs. We don't have tube TVs anymore. Human intervention is the key, and free markets allow new producers to compete in areas where they couldn't have existed before. But what if the government had come in and said back in 1960 or 70 or pick a decade, TVs are too expensive and we're going to regulate them, we're going to regulate the production of them and so forth. When government comes in, it tends to freeze things in place because it writes regulations based upon what it knows at that time. And then it makes it very difficult for anybody else to get into the space. We may be still having tube TVs had that happen. Fortunately, it did. The third thing, not thinking of beyond the initial consequences of particular policies. Well, this is running long, so I want to try to be brief on this. But all of you are well aware that the Biden administration has tried to reduce the amount of student debt. It's a great political ploy to get all you students to vote for them because, yay, you lowered my debt on student, or I'm hoping if I stick with you, you'll lower my debt. I won't have to pay back my bills. Okay, that's really nice. But that's only nice for you because you're getting a benefit. What about the people who don't get that benefit? Didn't choose to go to school, didn't choose to take out loans, already paid back those loans, or are older and don't have any benefit of those loans, yet their taxes are raised or taxed in order to be able to pay for that benefit. In fact, Supreme Court said the Biden administration couldn't do it, and then the Biden administration said, but we'll figure out a way around that. They're serving a specific audience in the short run for beneficial gain, but ignoring the long run and ignoring all the other groups. This is the essence of what Frederick Bastiat called a bad economist. What happens when we do things like that? Well, the money has to come from someplace. You can't just go to a bank and say, wipe that off your books. You don't get it paid back anymore. The government has to actually go pay your bill for you. Oh, where does it get the money? Well, deficit financing. This becomes government spending in a deficit financing framework. And where do they get that money? Well, if you needed extra money, you go to a bank and you take out a loan. The federal government does the same thing. They go to a bank, Federal Reserve Bank, and they borrow money, which means more money supply into the economy. Let me introduce one more economist. This is Milton Friedman. And you're going to see his video from which this is taken called I, Pencil, an essay written by Leonard Read. That is a fantastic discussion of how thousands and thousands of people come together to make a simple pencil. But that's not why I'm showing you Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman is really well known for a number of reasons, but one is he sort of got all of his reputation understanding the monetary system probably better than anyone else. In fact, he won a Nobel Prize for his history of the monetary system in the United States. What does Milton say? Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, in the sense that it can be produced only by a more rapid increase in the quantity of the money than in output. By output, he means when we produce things, we have growth. That's real growth. We call it the real economy because you're really producing things. You're producing cars, you're producing houses or building houses, you're producing food for sale and stuff, real things, right? And that has a measure of growth associated with it. When the money supply grows faster than the amount of goods in the economy, you get inflation. And without showing you direct evidence, we have had massive amounts of monetary growth compared to our GDP growth. So Milton's very big about this. So just in a few extra slides here, and we're almost done. What does inflation in your lifetime look like? Well, a lot of people will say different things about this. In fact, the politicians will be telling you, hey, inflation has really come down. And if you look at the very end of the Biden administration, inflation is measured in the percentage change, the red and the green line there. The red line is all items taken together. The green line is less food and energy. So you can see the red line is often very high. It means food and energy is much more volatile. They rise and fall. But what do we have to buy? We have to buy food and energy. What we don't have to buy is a lot of things that are in the rest of it. But nevertheless, you can see it looks like it's decreasing. But that big hill where inflation was very, very high doesn't go away. Those prices have still increased. The prices are still rising. It's just that the rate of inflation, which is a measurement of year over year, what do we look like, has gone down. Now, if you look at the different time periods, Bush, Obama, and Trump, inflation was fairly low. It was higher in Bush's administration. And in fact, the blue line shows the Federal Reserve Bank's target inflation rate of 2%. There's a reason for that. We'll get to that in Module 12. But how much higher during the Biden administration are we than that 2%? Much, much higher. Well, that's one way of looking at inflation in your lifetime. It is huge currently, and it's causing a lot of harm in the economy. But look, that's just rate of inflation, and the rate of inflation has come down. The prices have not. If you look at the blue line, this is all items, and if you look at the red line, this is, I chose food in your home. How much does it cost to go to the grocery store, buy food, take it home, and prepare it, right? That's the red line. So the prices have gone up, and even though the slope of that line is now lower, it's not coming down. It's still rising. This is what is often referred to as past changes are baked in. The prices have risen, you're not getting it back. The dotted line, by the way, is what the gasoline price is that you're paying right now, what it was under each of the administrations that are being shown. There's a whole lot more fallacies. You can come back and check these references for these articles if you want, and we can see some of the different names there. The fallacy of the free lunch, that means everything has got a cost. Fallacy of the short run, we're going to kind of talk about in the next chapter. Factfulness, the misconceptions. The world is divided only into two. Everything's just rich and poor. Or the world is getting worse, and we saw some data on that. And the world population just increases, and we saw some data on that as well. Other fallacies, the broken window. And we're going to be seeing the broken window as chapter 2 in the book by Frederick, or not by Frederick Bastiat. Frederick Bastiat originally told the story, The Broken Window, but in a book by Harry Hazlitt that you're going to start immediately after Module 1 and turn in your essay about it next Tuesday. So that's it for now. I hope this was worth your 54 minutes, and I hope it gives you a really good introduction to where we're heading this term.